Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unraveling a pretty massive economic mystery. Have you ever wondered how a geopolitical conflict happening literally thousands of kilometers away manages to quietly sneak its way right into your local grocery aisle? It's this hidden chain reaction, and it affects every single one of us every single day. So, let's dive right in.
Picture this. You're walking into your local grocery store. It's completely calm. You grab a loaf of bread, some cooking oil, maybe a bag of rice, and a carton of milk. It's just an everyday, peaceful routine. There aren't any soldiers in the supermarket, no tanks, no borders being crossed. But a war happening halfway across the planet is somehow driving the prices of those exact items up. It feels totally disconnected, right? Like, how does a distant conflict actually end up inside your shopping basket?
The invisible global grocery basket. Well, the answer lies in what we can call the invisible global grocery basket. You see, food doesn't just teleport directly from a farm onto your plate. It travels through this incredibly sensitive, highly interconnected global system. I actually like to think of it as a giant invisible web. When just one thread of that web gets pulled or snapped by a conflict, the vibrations are felt everywhere, literally right down to the checkout counter. Let's just track the journey of something super simple, like a loaf of bread. First, the wheat is harvested by a tractor, which runs on diesel. Then it's transported and milled into flour inside a factory that needs a lot of electricity. Then it's baked, packaged, moved yet again, and finally put on that shelf. Every single stage carries a cost, and every single stage is totally vulnerable to global disruption. So a conflict doesn't actually need to blow up your local supermarket to make your groceries more expensive. It just has to make the steps in this journey more expensive.
4 channels of price shocks. Energy. Let's push the first domino here. There are 4 main channels through which these price shocks happen, and the absolute biggest one is energy. Modern agriculture is entirely, undeniably dependent on fossil fuels. Tractors need diesel. Cold storage and processing plants need massive amounts of electricity. So when a war disrupts a major energy-producing region, it isn't just the gas stations that feel it. The cost of producing and moving food absolutely skyrockets. Now, the International Monetary Fund actually has a specific term for this dynamic. They call it a negative supply shock. That just means production becomes more expensive, causing inflation to rise and your household purchasing power to fall. The farmer pays more for fuel, the transport company pays more, the bakery pays more, and eventually they can't just absorb all those extra costs, They have to pass them down the chain until they reach you, the consumer.
So the crucial takeaway here is perfectly captured by this idea. You do not eat crude oil, but crude oil is embedded in the cost of almost everything you eat. Keep that little realization in the back of your mind the next time you wince at a food price tag. More often than not, you're actually looking at the hidden price of global energy.
4 channels of price shocks. Fertilizer.
Moving on to the second channel. This one is way less visible but absolutely critical. We're talking about fertilizer. Nitrogen fertilizer is literally the backbone of modern agriculture. But here's the catch. To make it, you need massive amounts of natural gas. When gas prices spike because of a conflict, fertilizer plants are forced to shut down or scale back production. And the ripple effect of that is just staggering. Take a look at this number, 30%. The World Bank projected that fertilizer prices would jump by over 30% in 2026 amid energy and trade disruptions. Now, if farmers have to pay 30% more, they're probably going to use less fertilizer, right? Which means lower crop yields. So a shock happening today creates this delayed, devastating wave that actually ruins next season's harvest. Food shocks don't just hit us once, they come in waves.
4 channels of price shocks. Shipping.
Let's see how this all builds with our third channel, which is shipping. Our global food supply relies super heavily on physical trade routes. Think of these routes as the vulnerable arteries of the world economy. And honestly, we're talking about a surprisingly small number of strategic maritime choke points here. The Strait of Hormuz, the Red Sea, the Suez Canal, the Black Sea, and the Strait of Malacca. The World Food Program constantly warns that when war threatens these specific routes, ships have to be completely rerouted, and that drastically increases the amount of fuel they burn, it adds weeks to their travel time, and it sends insurance premiums completely through the roof. So even if your food was grown thousands of miles away from any actual fighting, just transporting it has suddenly turned into a premium service.
4 channels of price shocks. The food itself.
And finally, we hit the fourth and honestly the most direct channel, the food itself. Sometimes, the countries actually involved in a conflict are massive producers of agricultural goods. We saw this incredibly clearly with the war in Ukraine. Russia and Ukraine are both huge exporters of grains and vegetable oils. When major exporters like that are in a conflict, global supplies just instantly shrink, and countries that depend on those imports are immediately exposed. But you know the shockwaves get even wilder when we look at the counterintuitive, almost hidden links in our global markets? Let's just trace the path of cooking oil for a second. So, a war raises the price of crude oil. Because crude is now so incredibly expensive, biofuels suddenly look like a much more attractive, cheaper alternative. Because of that, vegetable oil gets diverted away from food markets and gets poured right into fuel production. And boom, the price of your cooking oil spikes. It's not just a simple equation of war equals food shortage. It's actually war equals higher oil, which equals biofuel demand, which equals really expensive cooking oil. Crazy, right?
Fear and foreign exchange.
Okay, so those are our 4 initial channels. But unfortunately, it doesn't stop there. Now we have to look at the compounding factors that act like absolute accelerants to these initial price shocks, namely market panic and currency depreciation. You see, war doesn't even have to physically stop a shipment to raise prices. Fear does a pretty good job of that all by itself. Economists call this the expectations channel. When traders anticipate that a shipping route might close next month, they panic and buy more grain today. Companies start hoarding inventory. Insurers hike up their rates. War creates this uncertainty premium, and that fear gets baked into the exact price you pay at the checkout today, long before any actual shortage even happens.
And then there's the foreign exchange factor, which pretty much determines just how badly a specific country gets hit. A country with a strong currency, well, they can somewhat absorb a global commodity shock. But a country with a weak currency, they suffer a brutal double hit. Let's take Pakistan as a prime example here. They import a lot of energy and edible oil. If global wheat prices rise by 10% and at the same time the local currency depreciates by 10% against the US dollar, that country is basically importing massive inflation. So the exact same war produces vastly different grocery bills depending on where in the world you happen to live.
The unequal impacts of food inflation.
This brings us to a really crucial shift in our explainer. We need to zoom out from macroeconomics and get down to the deeply personal, household level. Because we absolutely have to understand the difference between global food availability and local food access. A higher grocery bill does not impact everyone equally. For instance, a wealthy household might spend maybe 10% of its income on food. If prices jump up, they probably just put a little less into their savings account that month. But a low-income household, they're spending 40 to 50% of their money just on food. When prices rise for them, they don't have savings to cut. They literally have to reduce calories, switch to lower quality food, or completely cut back on essentials like healthcare and education. Food inflation is just incredibly regressive. And this is exactly why the World Food Program identifies conflict as the primary driver of acute hunger. The world as a whole can have enough total food, but war destroys local access to it.
The government policy dilemma.
Faced with all of this, governments are put in an incredibly tough spot. They have to try and stop these economic dominoes from crushing their citizens, which leads us right into the government policy dilemma. And honestly, the choices are agonizing, and they come with some major pitfalls. If a government uses broad subsidies just to make food cheap for everyone, they completely drain their national finances. If they panic and ban food exports to keep everything at home, well, that triggers a huge collective action problem. Global supply shrinks even further, prices spike even higher, and then other countries start panicking too. And what about central banks just raising interest rates to fight off the inflation? Well, as the IMF rightly points out, higher interest rates cannot magically grow more wheat or manufacture more fertilizer. At the end of the day, it's a physical supply problem.
And if governments get this wrong, we hit what economists call the second-round effect. This is when a temporary disruption mutates into a permanent economic nightmare. Here's how it works. Workers face higher food costs, right? So naturally, they demand higher wages to survive. Then, restaurants and transport firms face higher labor and ingredient costs, so they have to raise their prices to stay afloat. Suddenly, inflation spreads from just oil and wheat into literally every corner of the wider economy.
Building resilience against shocks.
So, after exploring all of these vulnerabilities, the natural question is, what can actually be done? Let's pivot to some proactive solutions and look at how nations can fortify themselves against this invisible web of vulnerabilities. There are a few crucial strategies here. First up, diversify import sources so you aren't completely relying on just one trade route. Second, maintain strategic food reserves to help smooth over any temporary shocks. Third, improve domestic agricultural yields where possible. And fourth, rather than just subsidizing food for everyone across the board, target cash assistance directly to the most vulnerable households who actually need it. The big takeaway here is that true resilience isn't about trying to be 100% self-sufficient. It's about having viable, ready-to-go alternatives when the global systems fail. Which brings us to our final, somewhat provocative thought for this explainer.
Next time you're shopping, take a really good look at your grocery receipt. Is it just a bill for your bread and milk? Or is it actually a receipt of globalization? Because as we've seen today, a blocked strait, a damaged pipeline, or a distant conflict ultimately tallies up its costs, and it charges them directly to you at the checkout aisle. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. Stay curious and keep learning.